Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. I hope you've all had a great couple of weeks. If you are new, my name is Summer Sanchez and this channel is all about crime, cults, and heinous history. And today we are going to be talking about the Synanon cult. Have you heard of this one? Think of the Tony and Susan Alamo cult minus the extreme Christianity with a splash of wild, wild country, and that's kind of where we are today. In the 1950s, a recovered alcoholic named Chuck Dederich started Synanon, and it was initially operated as a rehabilitation clinic in Santa Monica, California that focused mainly on heroin addicts. Synanon became known to the public as a very successful rehabilitation center. It became so well known, in fact, that celebrities even got involved in Synanon. Then eventually Chuck decided to shift the rehab facility towards a more utopian experimental society. And from the outside, everything seemed really great. The members all seemed very happy, and it seemed like this experimental thing was actually working. But inside, things were starting to completely unravel. What had mostly been a peaceful little society turned into a living hell for a lot of people. Synanon is known today as being one of America's most dangerous and violent cults ever. And this is just a random side note, but Chuck Dederich is credited as being the person who coined the phrase, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." Now, I tried my best not to break this up into two parts, but because this cult lasted for decades, there's a ton of information. So I did end up having to make this a two-parter. We're going to be talking about some really heavy topics in this one. Physical and mental abuse of children, kidnapping, forced abortion, and forced sterilization are just some of the topics. Now we have a lot to get through, so let's go ahead and jump in. But before we do, I want to thank today's sponsor, Scentbird. So one deep, dark secret that I've been harboring for a while now is that I have been wearing the same perfume for over 10 years. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. I'm just one of those people that is just clueless when it comes to stuff like fragrances. So a long time ago, I found a scent that I liked and I just kind of stuck with it. And even if I did ever want to kind of venture out and step out of my comfort zone, I wouldn't even know where to start. That was until I was introduced to Scentbird. Scentbird is a monthly fragrance subscription service that has seriously opened up a whole new world for me when it comes to perfume. They have so many amazing options. They have really high-end stuff like Gucci, Prada, and Versace, and they also have indie labels like Skylar, Heretic, and Confessions of a Rebel. And their website does a good job of describing each of the scents so that you kind of get a feel of what you're choosing. Like personally, I lean more towards sweeter scents. So the one that I got this month called Violet Gem really resonated well with me. It has notes of vanilla, passion fruit, and sandalwood that just come together to make this amazing combination. That's sweet, but it's not like too sweet. But my favorite this month actually really surprised me. It was Ash by Ashley Benson, the East 12 one. And I loved it. It has notes of rose, orange, and black cedar, and they all just complement each other so well. There's this slight musk scent to it, which makes it a really good unisex option as well. It's described as electrifying and edgy, and I totally agree with that. And Scentbird does not skimp when it comes to the amount of product that you get either. With each fragrance, you get a 30-day supply, so you can really try out the scent before you commit to getting a full bottle. And look at these adorable reusable fragrance holders. This like deep purple one is my absolute favorite. Scentbird lets you choose a new fragrance every month for just $17. You can go to scentbird.com to get your own fragrance subscription started and use my code SUMMER at checkout to get 55% off your first month. That would make the total for the first month just a little over $7. That's code SUMMER, SOMMER, for 55% off your first month. Thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump back into the case. Charles Edwin Dederich, or Chuck as he was most often called, was born in Toledo, Ohio on March 22nd, 1913. He was the oldest of three boys, and he was born to his father Charles and his mother Agnes. The family was considered upper middle class, so they didn't struggle financially at all, but they did not have the best home life. Chuck's father had a drinking problem, and he also cheated on Chuck's mother all the time. And when Chuck was only 4 years old, his father died in a car accident. He had been driving while he was drunk, and it was discovered that he had been riding around town with another woman when the car crashed. Now, after this, Agnes completely leaned on Chuck for support. He became sort of like the surrogate father and husband of the house, and he's only 4 years old. He took on a lot of responsibilities at way too young of an age, and because of this, he really didn't have much of a childhood. He had to grow up really fast. Chuck had always been really close with his mother, and he was definitely her favorite, and this wasn't something that was hidden from the other children. Chuck could really do no wrong in Agnes's eyes, and when Chuck was 8 years old, the family suffered another tragedy when the youngest brother passed away after he contracted the flu. And the loss of his brother had a profound effect on Chuck's life. He just didn't ever really get close with any other children after that. He really pulled away. He blamed himself in a lot of ways. He felt like since he was supposed to be the man of the house, that somehow he had let this happen to his brother, and he just never really got over it. And then when Chuck was 12, something very traumatic happened. His mother got remarried. Chuck became insanely jealous when his mother got remarried, and he hated his stepfather pretty much from the very start. He did not like having to share his mother with another man. He later referred to his mom as his girl, and he talked about all the hate that he had for his stepfather. His mother's marriage just sent Chuck spiraling, and this is when he started to drink. This is kind of where his lifelong addiction to alcohol really started. Chuck eventually did graduate from high school, and he very briefly attended the University of Notre Dame, but he never really put any real effort into his studies, so he ended up flunking out. After this, he got a job at Gulf Oil, and he got married to his first wife, and together they had a son. But this marriage very quickly fell apart because of Chuck's excessive drinking. Then in 1942, at the age of 29, Chuck contracted meningitis, and this actually almost killed him, but he was given penicillin, which had just recently been made available for medical use, and this ended up saving his life. But he was left with permanent paralysis in his face, which caused one of his eyes to droop, and it also caused him to have a facial tic, which he lived with his whole life. Once he recovered, he started to realize that he had some memory loss as well. And this actually caused Chuck to drink even more. His alcoholism got even worse around this time because he was having to now cope with these new medical issues that he was having. He was described as being a functional alcoholic, so he was able to hold down a job and seem mostly coherent, but he was drunk almost all the time. In 1943, Chuck decided that he needed a change. So this is when he decided to move to Santa Monica, California. And he went there with the idea of basically being like a beach bum. He just wanted to kind of hang out on the beach and drink. And he did do this for a while, but eventually he did get a job at Hughes Tools, and he met and married his second wife. But this marriage too ended in divorce because of Chuck's drinking problem. After the failure of this second marriage, Chuck ended up attending his first ever AA meeting, and this changed everything for him. He listened as each person went up to the podium and told their story. He was completely captivated by this, and then it was his turn to go up, and he got up there to the podium and he just started talking, and he loved the way he felt when he was giving this speech. So AA became his new addiction, and he started going every day, and he ended up becoming one of the group's favorite speakers. Chuck was said to just have this charm about him. He had a way of captivating people when he spoke. He was said to be funny and blunt, but blunt in like a charming way. He just had this certain charisma that drew people to him. In 1957, Chuck took part in an experimental LSD treatment program at UCLA as a cure for alcoholism. And later on, he would recall this as the most important single experience in his life. He said that LSD had unlocked this incredible confidence inside himself that he had never known. And he said from that point forward, he just became a completely different person. And he credited that LSD trip for everything that happened in his life from that point on, including starting Synanon. Around this time, Chuck became really interested in Emerson's self-reliance, and this was just an essay that was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1841. And it really pushed the idea of nonconformity and just basically following your own instincts. This became almost like a life guide for Chuck. This essay was so inspirational to him that he ended up quitting his job the very next day so that he could devote 100% of his time to helping alcoholics get sober. And so he set out to try to find alcoholics that he could help. He would go into bars, he would go into alleyways, he would look on street corners, and he was really good at this. He helped a lot of people get sober. But this new venture did not pay well, and at this point, he's mostly just living on handouts from other people. But in the summer of 1957, Chuck did file for unemployment, and he used this money to rent out a small room in Ocean Park, which is a seaside community in Santa Monica, California. And this is around the time that Chuck started incorporating these group therapy sessions that he called the game. And these therapy sessions are very important to the entire story of Synanon, really. Without the game, Synanon probably would have never even been formed. The game was loosely modeled after group therapy sessions that you would see at like an AA meeting, but instead of being like uplifting and, listening to people's problems and trying to help them, Chuck's sessions were more attack therapy, and there was just a lot of volatility involved. During the game, there would be about a dozen or so people in the room, and there would be a player, and that was the person that was the focus of the game. The only thing that was off limits was violence or the threat of violence. But other than that, you could say whatever you want. You were actually encouraged to be cruel to these people.
You can say nothing! Take it easy! I didn't break the window! I didn't have to say, Tony, please take it easy!
You could accuse them of doing things that they really didn't do, cuss them out, just basically say whatever you wanted. Literally, nothing except violence was off limits. The player could actually start yelling as well and kind of try to flip it on someone else during the game. And these sessions would last for hours sometimes. Now, outside of the sessions, people were expected to be kind to one another. They were expected to be uplifting and respectful. And once the game session was over, everyone had to walk out of that room and leave behind any bad feelings that they had worked up while they were playing the game. They had to be left behind in the room. And the people actually loved it. Word spread pretty quickly about the game, and people started coming from all over other areas in that little part of California to be closer to Chuck and to play the game. His group started growing really fast. And this is really when Chuck began to make a name for himself. And eventually heroin addicts started showing up as well, not just alcoholics. And they wanted to join in on these sessions too. And they also loved it. It was helping them to get their minds off of their addictions, and a lot of them stopped using drugs. Now, the alcoholics did not like the heroin addicts joining their group. So Chuck had a decision to make. He could either stop letting the heroin addicts join in and just focus all of his efforts on his AA group, or he could try something that hadn't really been done yet, and he could focus his group solely on heroin addiction. And in the end, Chuck figured, there's a ton of AA groups out there. He ended up kicking out the alcoholics and devoting the entire group to helping people he referred to as dope fiends. One day in 1958, while Chuck was conducting a game with some of the new members, one of them jumbled the word seminar and symposium together, and it came out Synanon. Chuck kind of liked this word, but he ended up changing the ending to anon for anonymous. And this is actually how the name Synanon became a thing. Now, Chuck had no real experience in helping heroin addicts get clean. He was an alcoholic, and he only ever had experience helping other alcoholics. Proper rehab centers have doctors and counselors on staff to oversee everything. There's often use of drugs to help with withdrawal symptoms. And there are certain licensing and regulations that you're supposed to follow. And Chuck didn't have any of this. And since he didn't really know what he was doing, he just made all the addicts quit cold turkey, which can be really dangerous. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in your brain and in your body during withdrawals. Chuck likely didn't know any of that though. And so his method was to just make them go cold turkey. And he would put them on a couch and just wait until they worked through their withdrawals. And once a person was clean and sober, Chuck would encourage them to disassociate from their families. And he tried to say that this would be a way to keep them from relapsing. They were cut off from any outside influence. And there were a lot of people that actually left their children to stay a part of Synanon. Chuck would just tell them that their sobriety and their survival depended on them staying close to him and staying in Synanon. And he would tell them that if they left, they had a high chance of dying. And this is all very manipulative. I imagine someone who has managed to pull themselves out of a severe heroin addiction, probably lives with crippling fear that one day they're going to fall back into that. And Chuck used this fear to his advantage, and he would just manipulate the members into staying. So the people stayed and Synanon grew. And Chuck preached something called the act as if way of life to his members. He said that thinking is what got them there in the first place, and so they just shouldn't think anymore. Instead, they should let Synanon do the thinking for them, and they should just act as if everything Synanon told them was right.
When a person comes into Synanon, we do not have on our hands a potentially violent person or a rebel at all. We have then a person that is looking for boundaries. He then is looking for someone to tell him what to do, isn't he?
Eventually, Chuck moved the group's headquarters to a nearby storefront. At this point, Chuck had established himself firmly as the leader. He had really made this image of himself kind of like a father figure to the other members, and some of them actually even called him dad, or there was one I know for sure that called him Big Daddy. And at this point, everyone really did love Chuck. And it seemed like he was truly trying to help these people.
He was the first person I have ever met that was able to somehow cut through the nonsense. He struck a chord.
I'm quite convinced that he actually knows more about me than I know about myself.
He's probably the most totally honest person I have ever met in my life.
He was taking these addicts off of the street and he was giving them new hope. And on September 18th, 1958, Chuck got his group tax-exempt nonprofit status under the name Synanon Foundation, Inc. So Synanon was official. In 1959, Chuck found an old 3-story National Guard building called the Armory, and it was right on Santa Monica Beach, and it was much nicer than what they were living in this storefront. So he thought this would be the perfect place for Synanon's new headquarters. The group had just continued to grow, and they really did need something bigger and nicer. Now, the people that were living near the new Synanon headquarters on Santa Monica Beach, they were not thrilled about Chuck moving Synanon into their area. They were worried that people would go into Synanon, not actually get clean, and they would just kind of make Santa Monica their new home.
You see, every place where we move in, the neighbors all storm the city council and say, here come the dope fiends. They're going to sack the city.
But despite the neighbors' concerns, Chuck made Santa Monica Beach his new home, and Synanon became even more well-known in the area. Eventually, Chuck had so many addicts walking right up off the beach and into Synanon that he had to make a waiting list, and he started having to interview people and then tell them to come back for an answer. Synanon was becoming very well-known in California as this very successful rehabilitation center for addicts, and people thought highly of Chuck and thought really highly of Synanon. And Senator Thomas Dodd once said that Synanon could, quote, lead the way in the future to an effective treatment for not only drug addicts, but also criminals and juvenile delinquents. And he even told President Kennedy that Synanon was a miracle on the beach, which is a very famous line that is used to describe the early days of Synanon. It really was seen as this really amazing thing that Chuck was doing. He was giving these people new hope. At this time in America, there were only a few other facilities that focused on drug addiction, and they were not nice places. One former Synanon member described them as being closer to a prison or a mental institution than an actual rehabilitation facility. The people were not treated well at all, and they would go into these places and they could kick their habits, but as soon as they left, they would go right back into it. And because Chuck had kind of created this atmosphere where no one really left Synanon once they got clean, Synanon became known as this place where people went in, they kicked their habit, and then they never looked back. Now, eventually the authorities became aware of Chuck, and they found out that he was operating this drug rehabilitation center illegally. He had no licensing, and there was also some sort of zoning issue involved. So in 1960, Chuck was ordered to vacate the Armory, but he refused. So he ended up being sent to jail, and he was sentenced to 30 days. And suddenly, Synanon and Chuck were all over the news, and not just the California news either. people from all over the United States were learning about Synanon. And Chuck actually loved this because it put him in the spotlight and it made him look like a hero to addicts. Here's this selfless man that's devoted his life to helping these people, and the Santa Monica PD is just ganging up on him. So this whole thing gained the attention of Governor Edmund Brown, and he ended up signing the Save Synanon bill, which gave Synanon exemption status from health licensing laws in California. And since they didn't have to follow any sort of licensing rules, Chuck was allowed to treat his patients however he wanted. The medical board was supposed to set some rules in place for Synanon specifically, but this never ended up happening. And it's really unfortunate that this whole thing even happened, because it kind of let Chuck know that he was above the law in some way, and he definitely takes advantage of the situation. In the early 1960s, Chuck married a woman named Betty Coleman. She was a former sex worker, and she had come to Synanon back in 1959 to try to kick her heroin addiction. Betty was a Black woman and Chuck was a white man, so their relationship was something that was still not really accepted at the time, and their marriage was actually meant to set an example to others. Their relationship was supposed to reinforce the idea that Chuck wanted Synanon to be about integration and inclusivity. Now, when members joined Synanon, they had walked away from their families, including their children, like I mentioned earlier. But in the early 1960s, Chuck started allowing some of the members to go get their children and bring them into Synanon and let them live there with them. And so a lot of people did this, and before long, Synanon had lots of little kids running around. Now, as they got further into the 1960s, Chuck started itching for something new. So he started hosting these really crazy parties on Saturday night at Synanon, and anyone was invited. This is not just for addicts, this is for the general public. People were very curious about Synanon. They wanted to know what was going on in there, and so Chuck thought this would be the perfect opportunity to let regular people come and see what the Synanon people were all about. So they would have these wild, crazy parties, and the only rule really was that there was no drugs or alcohol involved. But people didn't care about the no drugs or alcohol. They had a great time. They danced and just hung out and laughed and got to know each other. People were showing up every Saturday night to come and hang out with the Synanon people. And soon famous people were showing up to these parties. People like Charlton Heston, Lucille Ball, and Jane Fonda all attended Synanon parties. Also, Steve Allen, who was the original host of The Tonight Show, he was a regular at the Saturday night parties. Leonard Nimoy came to Synanon to teach acting classes, and Bobby Seale, who was the leader of the Black Panthers, would come to Synanon to play the game as well. Also, legendary jazz guitarist Joe Pass was actually treated at Synanon for his heroin addiction, and he worked with some of the other members of Synanon to make his debut album. And there's a song on the album that's called CED, which actually stands for Charles Edwin Dederich. And then in 1965, a movie was made about Synanon. And this wasn't some tiny production. This was a major motion picture starring Edmund O'Brien as Chuck and Eartha Kitt as Betty. And it was actually filmed in the Synanon headquarters in Santa Monica.
I was what they call a swinger. I did nothing but get high and sold myself to pay for it.
So yeah, Chuck had definitely made Synanon a household name at this point. People were flocking to Synanon, and not just heroin addicts either. Non-addicts were showing up as well, and they wanted in. And these people became known around Synanon as the squares or lifestylers. They were mostly middle-class people looking for something different. A lot of these lifestylers had been to the parties, like I said. Some of them had even participated in the games at Synanon. Synanon was becoming known as not just a drug rehabilitation center. It was actually becoming part of the counterculture. So before long, Synanon completely transformed. It was no longer just a drug rehab facility. It was now this utopian experimental society, or as Chuck described it, a quote, social movement to help people learn how to live. All of this notoriety ended up bringing in a lot of money to Synanon. And in 1967, Synanon bought the Del Mar Club, which at one time had been an oceanfront luxury hotel. It was right on the beach and just down the street from the Armory. It was 6 stories tall. It had ballrooms, it had Olympic swimming pools, tennis courts, and it had its own private beach right on the Pacific Ocean. This purchase of the Del Mar Club made it possible for Chuck to open up the doors for the lifestylers, and soon they were moving in with the addicts. And most of these people had really good jobs, so they were working their jobs and handing over their money to Synanon. This was another huge cash flow for Chuck. Some of them even sold their homes and all their possessions and handed that money over to Chuck as well. And eventually there were so many lifestylers trying to get into Synanon that they outgrew the Del Mar Club too. Chuck needed to expand again, and he had bought some land a few years before in this area of Northern California called Tamales Bay in Marin County, and he decided that this would be the perfect place. Unlike other locations that they had previously been in, this Tamales Bay location was very secluded. It wasn't in the city. It didn't have a lot of people around like the Santa Monica location did. So there was a lot of room for expansion. So by 1968, the construction of this new location was complete, and Chuck and Betty and about 30 to 40 Synanon members went to go live in Tamales Bay. After this move to Tamales Bay, Chuck's hold over the group had become extremely strong, and he was constantly testing the members' loyalty. When he quit smoking, he made it law that everyone in Synanon quit smoking, and they did. Eventually, Betty was diagnosed with diabetes, and she had to cut back on her sugar. Chuck made it law that everyone had to do this as well, and they did. And now these are very like trivial little rules and laws, like these are harmless, but later on, this same little test of loyalty is applied in very disturbing ways. This is just the beginning. Other locations did open up eventually as well. There's a San Francisco location. There's one in Badger, California. Chuck couldn't be at all these places at once, so he decided to incorporate something that he called The Wire. And The Wire was essentially a radio broadcast, and Chuck would get on there and it would broadcast whatever he was saying, whatever message he needed to send. It would broadcast it out to all of the locations at once. A lot of the communications over The Wire were recorded. He was all about recording everything. There are even sessions of the game that were recorded as well. And it's these recordings of Chuck speaking over The Wire that's been used for years in studying him and studying Synanon. And it's also how Chuck was eventually linked to some really bad stuff that we're going to talk about in part 2. So there were some members of Synanon that were coming in and they had never even met Chuck, but they would come into these different locations and there would be pictures of Chuck all over the walls, and they would hear his voice come over the wire almost in a godlike way. And everyone wanted to prove their loyalty to Chuck. And the move to Tamales Bay also brought on some new, very bizarre rituals. So one of the new rituals or experiences, whatever you want to call it, was called the trip, and it lasted for 48 hours. According to a former member, during the trip, there would be a group of participants and they would be dressed all in white robes. And then there would be a Synanon team that would be kind of like leading the whole thing. The people directing would have robes on as well, but they would also be wearing Mobius loops that were different colors depending on their role in the trip. So the seekers were the participants. There were also guides that wore the white robes and they had on orange Mobius loops, and they acted as the priests, and during the trip, they would encourage the seekers to confess their sins. There were also shepherds who were wearing the white robes and yellow Mobius loops, and their purpose was to guide and protect the participants. And then there were conductors, and the conductors were the only ones that were wearing different color robes, and the robes were described as looking very royal, and they kind of were the ones leading everything. So the way it started was the participants would be dressed in their robes and they would be brought into a room. They would be asked a series of questions, and then they would be separated based on their answers to those questions. From there, those groups would then be guided into different rooms to play the Synanon game. They would do these really intense game sessions, and then they would take a break, and during their breaks they would kind of relax. They would read Emerson essays like Self-Reliance, the one that Chuck was so obsessed with that it had a huge effect on his life. Midnight on the second day of the trip was known as the witching hour. This is when the participants would be blindfolded and then led into rooms. Once they got into these rooms, they could hear chanting. There were people in there that were doing like these Gregorian type of chants. once they were in there, they would have their feet washed with hot water and oil by the shepherds. Then at about 4 a.m., they would be brought into another room. And in this room, there would be a Ouija board set up, and there would be incense burning. More people in robes would be working the Ouija board. There were a couple of other new experiences. One of them was called the stew, and that one lasted 84 hours. There was another one called the dissipation that they incorporated. So during one of these dissipation sessions, some of the members started bowing to Chuck and referring to him as God and asking for his forgiveness. This really freaked Betty out. Whenever she saw it, she didn't like that at all. And she would later say that it kind of scared her when she saw this happen. This is no longer a drug rehab facility. It's no longer a utopian experimental society. This is a cult. So one day, one of the lifestylers was taking part in one of the stew sessions. And during the session, she confessed that she had taken one of the cameras from Synanon and she sold it. Now, this particular woman was very much about gender equality. She was a very outspoken feminist. And so when Chuck found out what she had done, he said, well, you know, as punishment, you should have to shave your head. All the men have their heads shaved, so if you really are all about equality, then that's what you need to do. At this point in Synanon, all the men had started to shave their heads, but the women hadn't. So this woman was like, you know what? Okay. And she had her head shaved right there. Now, this was all being communicated over the wire. And so all the locations were hearing what was happening. And within 2 hours, every woman in Synanon had gotten in line to have her head shaved. Even Betty Dederich had her head shaved. So this is kind of where the whole shaved head thing started in Synanon, but eventually Chuck made it law that everyone had to do it. In 1971, George Lucas was shooting his first full-length movie called THX 1138. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It could be 1138. I don't know. I'd never actually heard of this movie until I researched this case. During filming, he needed some people with bald heads to play extras. So George had heard about Synanon. He knew about the shaved head thing. So he approached Chuck and Synanon, and he ended up casting a lot of their members to play extras in this movie. And there's actually one scene in particular where there's a really good overhead view and you can see all the little bald Synanon heads. Now, up until now, things have progressively gotten weirder, but not especially harmful. But from this point on, we are going to be talking about some pretty messed up stuff. I very briefly mentioned children earlier in the video, haven't really talked about them that much, and they were mentally and physically abused while they were in Synanon. In part one, we're mainly just focusing on the mental abuse of the children, but it's still very upsetting. So once Chuck had made the shift from drug rehab facility to experimental society, he kind of started incorporating some harsh rules whenever it came to the children and really just the families in Synanon in general. Synanon established a group of members called the Kid Snatchers. The Kid Snatchers started as a support group for members who had left their children behind when they came to Synanon and they just really missed them. The whole point of this group was to kidnap their children from the outside world and bring them into Synanon. So if the family members who had custody of the children on the outside, if they refused to hand them back over, then the Kid Snatchers worked to kidnap them and to bring them into Synanon. The kids would be kidnapped by the Kid Snatchers, then they would be brought to one of the facilities. Their heads would immediately be shaved. Children in the cult were forced to participate in the game sessions starting at age 4, which is insane. So if the child that had been kidnapped was of age, they would also be forced to play the game. And then after they played the game, they would have this little birthday party where they would be given a cake and all the other members would sing this weird Synanon birthday song to them. And this was supposed to symbolize their new birth into Synanon. Then the children would be separated from their parents and sometimes even brought to completely separate facilities. They were told that their mom and dad were no longer their mom and dad and that everyone in the cult was actually their mom and dad. There were no specific parents allowed. Chuck had made it a rule that the children would be raised completely separate from their biological parents, and instead they would be raised by the cult as a whole. And if the parents of the child actually did live in the same facility, they were allowed 3 hours per week with their children. And not only were these kids separated from their parents, but if they were kidnapped and brought into Synanon with siblings, they were separated from them as well. And this was just another one of Chuck's psychological experiments. Can you even imagine? This had to be so confusing and traumatic for these children. They didn't see their parents for years in some cases. Then all of a sudden, they're reunited with their parents only to be separated again. And now they're in this really weird place with all these strange people that are now supposed to be your new parents. During my research, I read about this little girl named Selena, and she arrived in Synanon in 1977. Selena and her mother had been really close whenever she was little. Her mom and dad had split up when she was very young, but they had stayed close friends. But Teresa struggled a lot with mental health issues, and she was put on medication to treat depression, but the medication caused her to sometimes go into a catatonic state. So she was definitely struggling a lot with her mental health. Now, Selena's dad noticed how much of a struggle Teresa was having. He suggested that she go to one of the Synanon parties. He had been to a Synanon party before, and he had had this great time. He had met all kind of new people, and he just thought it would be a good way for her to get out and meet new people and have fun. He specifically said, go and have fun, but stay away from the people with the bald heads. And Teresa did take his advice, and she attended one of the Synanon parties. She was in such a vulnerable state at that point. She probably was a very easy target for the Synanon people to kind of manipulate, and she was pulled in to the group. And she ended up moving into Synanon as a lifestyler, and Selena was sent to live with her father, and she was only 4 years old at this time. A couple of years go by. Selena has not seen her mother, and one day her uncle calls up her dad and asks if Selena can go spend a few days with him at his house so she could go play with her cousins. And her dad agrees, and he ends up dropping Selena off at the uncle's house. That night, some people knock on the door. The uncle opened up the door. There were these women standing there, and they were bald. Selena just keeps looking at one of the women, really confused, but like she thinks she's seen her somewhere. And then all of a sudden it dawns on her that this is her mother. Teresa was a part of the Kid Snatchers, and she had come to kidnap Selena and take her back to Synanon. She hadn't seen her mother in over 2 years, so this was all just completely overwhelming for her. Once they got to Synanon, Selena was taken into this area where all these other children were, and as soon as she walked in, all these kids with shaved heads just rushed over to her, and they were just all surrounding her, and they wanted to touch her hair. And Teresa told the kids, just get in line. You're all going to get a chance to brush Selena's hair. So Selena was forced to stand there while all these kids that she didn't know took turns brushing her hair. Then after this was over, Teresa just leaves the room and leaves Selena there. Then eventually another Synanon woman walked in and told Selena to follow her, and she guided her down this really long hallway and into a bathroom. And the woman told Selena that she was going to make her a Synanon child, and she shaved Selena's head. Then she told her how beautiful she was now, and then she gave her some overalls to wear, which overalls had pretty much become the uniform of Synanon. Chuck had started wearing overalls at some point, so everyone in Synanon just kind of followed, so that's what they wore all the time. The next day, Selena was taken into this room with a bunch of other kids, and there was a woman there, and this woman told Selena that she was going to play the game. Selena had no clue what this is, so the woman conducting the game explained to her that it was a place where she could say whatever she was feeling, literally whatever she wanted to. She could even say bad words if she wanted to. And Teresa was there as well. So the game started, and the woman who was conducting everything began by yelling at Teresa about what a terrible mother she was, and look what she had done to her daughter, and all these different things. And then the woman looked at Selena and told her, okay, now you tell your mother how you're feeling. You can say whatever you want. But Selena didn't want to yell at her mother. She loved her mother. She didn't want to take part in any of this. She was just really confused. But the kids in the room, they all started yelling and screaming at each other and cussing. It was just like this really chaotic experience. And Selena just sat there and watched. She had no clue what to do or say. And then after that, she was given a cake. They handed her like this birthday cake, and they all started singing this weird Synanon birthday song. And Selena said she was so confused because she knew her birthday was not this day, but she was being forced to take part in this weird birthday celebration. Keep in mind that Selena is 6 years old. I have a 6-year-old daughter, okay? And the whole time I was reading this, I just kept imagining my own daughter and how she would feel and how she would potentially react to anything like this. And it's just so heartbreaking to even think about. There's a really good book called Synanon Kid, and it's actually written by Selena, and she goes into a lot of detail about her experience. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in this case. Countless other kids went through very similar experiences when they were kidnapped and brought to Synanon. And starting at just 6 months old, the children were kept in the Synanon school. And this is where they lived. They pretty much never left the property, and they were, again, just completely isolated from their families. A lot of the children would go months without seeing their parent, and they were discouraged from ever even asking about their parents. And there were a lot of kids who were born into Synanon. When a Synanon woman became pregnant, she was sent to this place called the hatchery. And the hatchery is described as an experimental nursery where the Synanon babies were kept with the mothers for a short amount of time, and they were all completely isolated from the rest of Synanon. So the pregnant women would all live together there in the hatchery. The woman who was closest to giving birth would be sent to the nesting room. This is the room where the women would give birth, and all the other mothers would help during the birthing process. And once the babies were born, all the mothers would nurse each other's children, not just their own biological child. And this was just to really drive home the idea that all of the children belonged to everyone. Once the babies were about 6 months old, they were taken from the mothers and they were sent to the Synanon school. The mothers rarely saw the babies in most cases. Very soon after the moms handed over their babies to the school, most of them went to work for the Synanon sales team called AdGap. They sold office supplies and like mugs and stuff like that. And this AdGap thing actually ended up being a really big source of revenue for Synanon. Now, understandably, a lot of women did struggle once they handed their children over, but they complied and they just tried to focus their attention on working. This is what Chuck wanted, and to show your loyalty, this is just what you had to do. After a while, Chuck decided that he didn't want any more children born into Synanon, and he needed to do something about that. Chuck sold this whole no more kids policy as a form of women's liberation, and he said, quote, "The big slavery of women in modern life is that they are tied to that one child for 18 years. What Synanon has done for women is release them from that bondage." You know, basically making it sound like he was doing this for the women and they should actually be thankful. But it was more about the financial burden. He once said, quote, "I think children are a very bad investment. We have not cashed in on any children born into Synanon." So Chuck made it law that no more kids were to be born into the cult. Before that, though, he created a group called the Breeders. And this group consisted of people who wanted one last opportunity to have a child, and these would be the last of the Synanon babies. There were a handful of couples that did decide to take part in the Breeders program, and they did have one more child. After that, Chuck was done, and to make sure no more babies could be born into the cult, he made it law that every man aged 18 and up had to have a vasectomy in order to remain in Synanon. And there were doctors in Synanon who were giving these vasectomies right there in the facility. Most of the men did decide to have the vasectomies done, but there were some that didn't do it and they ended up leaving. So these vasectomies were going to solve the problem of future children. But there were women who were already pregnant when this whole thing went to law. There were 5 women in the cult that were pregnant. Chuck did force these women to have abortions if they wanted to stay in Synanon. And out of the 5 women who were pregnant, only one of them decided to just leave. One of the former members said that she had a roommate that was one of the women who decided to stay and, you know, have the abortion done, and she was just quickly whisked away, and she had it done, and then she came back, and it was like no one talked about it. It's like it just didn't even really happen. But this is how desperate these people were to prove themselves to Chuck. So the people who refused to have vasectomies or to get the abortions ended up leaving the cult, like I said. And they took this as a huge wake-up call that Synanon was turning into something really ugly and so far away from their original message. So at this point, several vasectomies had been performed, but there were a bunch that still needed to be done. It was decided that doctors would be brought in and there would just be like this mass vasectomy party in Synanon that weekend. So in total, there were going to be 300 to 400 vasectomies performed at Synanon. And they were to be done that weekend for these people to be able to remain in the cult. Now, there was a Synanon member named Phil Ritter, and he finally had enough after he heard about this big vasectomy party. Once he found out that there were going to be like 300 to 400 vasectomies performed at Synanon that weekend, he decided he was done, and he hopped on his motorcycle and rode straight to the police station to let them know what was happening. So Phil went in to the station. He tells them everything. The police just basically laughed in his face. They were like, okay, so you're telling us there's a bunch of heroin users over there and they're all of age and they're all having vasectomies and you want us to stop it. Not only did they pretty much laugh at Phil, they then called Synanon and told them what Phil had just done, that he had basically told on them. That made Phil a huge enemy to Chuck and to Synanon. It pretty much put a huge target on him, and he was kicked out of Synanon that day. He had a wife and a kid that were still in the group. But remember Phil Ritter, because he comes back up in part 2 in a really big way. In Chuck's like never-ending quest to screw with people, he eventually turned his attentions to messing with people's love lives. He made it a rule that if you had been with a person for 6 months, you were either to marry them or you were to break up. So 75 couples ended up getting married in this like big group wedding. The men were dressed up in overalls and these like straw hats. The women had on like handmade gowns and stuff. And they had this reverend that was up there, and he performed the wedding ceremony at the same time to all these people. Later in the 1970s, Betty Dederich was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a terminal form of cancer. And sadly, she passed away in April of 1977. Everyone loved Betty. She was like this really gentle presence. She was just really well loved in the group. So this was a huge blow to everyone, and especially Chuck. He was devastated when Betty died. But he did manage to pick up the pieces and marry soon after Betty passed away. He ended up getting with this woman named Jenny. She was a Synanon member, and she was only 31 at the time, and Chuck was 64. So once again, Chuck expected all of his cult members to follow his lead. It was decided that there was going to be something called a separation ceremony. So during a separation ceremony, the married couple would stand facing each other, and they would basically just talk about why they loved each other, and then they would talk about why they wanted to end their marriage and just become friends. It was more symbolic than anything, because right after the separation ceremony, you could just get right back with your spouse if you wanted to, or you could stay separated. And this is how it was pitched. So a bunch of couples decided to just take part in this. You know, it was something weird and new that they could do, so they signed up to do it. So they go through with this separation ceremony. Most of them wanted to get right back with their original spouses. They didn't want to stay separated. But Chuck had changed his mind. He came over the wire and he said everyone in the cult had to find a new spouse. They had to dissolve their current marriages and go get with someone new. Like, it wasn't an option. If you were going to stay in Synanon, this is what you had to do. The majority of the people did exactly what Chuck told them to do. They left their current spouse and they went and found a different one. So all these couples were like marrying each other at this point. And some of these people had been married for over 30 years. There were some people that refused though, and they ended up leaving the group. Actually, Chuck's own brother and his wife, they had been married for a really long time and they just weren't willing to do this. So that's when they left Synanon. Everybody had kind of, paired up, and now the new couples were expected to consummate this union as well. So this was not just like a symbolic thing. This was like, no, now you are married to this person and you're going to make it official. One of the former members said that she and her husband were very much in love and they wanted to be together. They did not want to split up like this, but her husband was a higher up in Synanon, and at this point they just weren't ready to up and leave. So they went ahead and complied with the new law and they found new partners. But she said the person that she was paired up with was kind of in the same situation as her, and he really loved his wife and he didn't want to be with anyone else. So the night that they were supposed to consummate their relationship, they couldn't do it, and they just cried basically all night long. But eventually all the members were put into game sessions, and during the sessions they were asked about whether or not they had sex with their new partner. She just lied. Her and her new partner, they just lied and said that they had, because they didn't want to get in trouble. They knew that they would be kicked out of Synanon. And so they just lied and said they had, but they never did. This is like psychological torture for most people. The thought of the person that they love more than anything, the person that they're supposed to spend their entire lives with, the person that they have children with, is now having sex in another room with someone else, likely a person that you're very familiar with because that's another Synanon person. I can't imagine having to deal with something like that. Again, lots of people complied. Chuck later said that he thought it would be funny to perform what he thought was emotional surgery on a group of people who were getting along really well. But there are a lot of people that think that the real reason why Chuck did this is because he was still in a lot of pain over losing Betty, and he was forced to find somebody else to be with. So he wanted all of the Synanon members to feel that same kind of loss that he was feeling, which honestly, that theory sounds exactly like something Chuck would do. Just knowing the type of person he is, I could totally see him doing something like that. And by the end of that year, over 300 couples had found new partners, which is insane to think about. So this part 1 has mostly been focused on psychological abuse within the cult. I haven't even touched on the physical abuse, the extreme violence, or the multiple murder plots that Synanon was involved in. That little rule that Chuck had in the very beginning about no violence allowed, that goes straight out the window, and we're going to talk all about that in part 2. And if you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel and turning on notifications so you'll know exactly when I upload part 2. And I will have that uploaded for you next Sunday, so it won't be too long of a wait. And thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and don't forget you can look in my comments or in the description box of this video for the link to get 55% off your first month using my code SUMMER. Thank you so much for watching this video and hanging out with me today. I'll see you next time.